Hello, and welcome to the fourth webinar in our 2015 High Tunnel webinar series. I'm Miranda Combs, and I'm an Extension Associate with the Center for Crop Diversification at the University of Kentucky. Today we'll learn about crop and equipment options in high tunnels, along with nutrient and irrigation management in high tunnels. Dr. Krista Jacobson will start us off talking about crop production options and schedules in high tunnels. Then Dr. John Wilhoit will share information about equipment that can be utilized in high tunnels, and finally Dr. Shubin Saha will talk about irrigation and fertilization in high tunnel systems. I'd like to let everyone know that there are a few documents available for download in the Files to Download pod in the left corner of your screen, and there are some video links via YouTube in the Web Links pod. Dr. Wilhoit will be talking about these videos during his part of the presentation. I also want to remind everyone that the recordings of our past two webinars are available on the Center for Crop Diversification website, along with the documents referenced during each webinar. Please visit our website and navigate to our events page. All the archived webinars will be available in the right column of that page. A few housekeeping notes. To ask questions, simply type your questions into the chat box in the lower right corner of your screen. Christy Cassidy from the Center for Crop Diversification will be helping us answer questions throughout the presentation. Also, this webinar is being recorded and will be available in a few days on the Center for Crop Diversification's events page. Finally, at the end of the webinar, we'll have a survey link available for you to provide some feedback for us. We really appreciate and listen to the feedback you provide. We hope you enjoy the presentation and take away some great information. Without any further ado, I'll hand the presentation over to Dr. Krista Jacobson. Welcome, Krista.
Thanks, Miranda. All right. Right, okay, great, thank you. All right, well, so I'm going to be talking a little bit today about some systems that my group has been managing at the University of Kentucky Horticulture Research Farm, where we're focused on diversified year-round production systems in high tunnels. So by diversified, I mean that we're growing quite a variety of crops at any given time within a single high tunnel. So in contrast to what you might typically see in Kentucky, a high tunnel full of tomatoes or cucumbers or some of the things that Shubin is going to be talking about. I'm talking about various crops grown year-round at any given time in one high tunnel. And we'll be showing lots of pictures so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about here. I should also mention that the tunnels that you're going to see are managed organically. That's kind of one of my areas of expertise. I'm actually terrible at conventional agriculture questions, so those will be going to Shubin, but my background is primarily in organics, and I'd be happy to field questions that way as well. All right, so we're going to go a little bit over the projects. I'm going to talk to you about rotations and different planting dates for these various crops. I do want to say that located here in the central bluegrass, that our planting dates might be a little bit different than some of you folks who might be in the far west or south. You all might be able to plant a little earlier than some of the dates that you're going to see here, and you folks in the east might be planting a little bit later. So the main thing here is feel free to experiment. And I'm also only speaking from about 4 years of experience. So we've had some warm years, we've had some cool years, and we've had some polar vortexes that I can speak to, but I certainly don't have decades of experience at this. We do have some fantastic growers in the state who are going to be joining us for our last webinar, the Wiedegers, who do have decades of experience with diversified high tunnels. And we've learned a lot from them as well. I'll be talking a little bit about some lessons learned in regards to planting dates and some other things, spacing related, irrigation wise, etc. And then I'm just going to touch very briefly on some organic fertility management. I'll primarily just do an overview of how we run our basic fertility program in these tunnels, and then I'll leave questions at the end. All right, so the main goal for the high tunnels that I've been managing, this was funded off of Kentucky Department of Agriculture Specialty Crop Block Grant, both in 2010 and 2012. And the idea here was to develop diversified rotations for movable and stationary high tunnels. I'm not going to talk very much about our movable high tunnels today. I'm just going to touch a little bit on how we manage those rotations in the very big picture. But I'll be focusing on the diversified, kind of setting up a diversified system. And I wanted to put this picture up here as well. This is just a small number of the folks who have put a serious amount of time into the high tunnels at the farm. So although I've been around and doing this and kind of guiding the work, there are a lot of folks who you're going to see pictures of throughout this who really do the nitty gritty and have more experience than I do in the field in some ways. So just very briefly, overview, you see that we have 3 stationary, 3 movable high tunnels. That's kind of 3 adjacent field plots. The main difference here is our stationary tunnels don't move. All of our tunnels are a standard 30 by 72 kit. The movable tunnels, I spoke about in webinar 2, I guess, in this series. So if you want to hear more about those, you can go back to that webinar. The main reason I mention this is, simply just to point out the different types of rotations that we have out there, and also that the data that I'm going to be drawing on is replicated from a scientific perspective. So basically, we don't have 6 high tunnels out there. We have 1 high tunnel replicated 3 times in terms of a stationary tunnel, and a movable tunnel replicated 3 times, if that makes sense. Okay. So here you get an inside view of a high tunnel in the middle of the summertime. I also putter a little bit with summer cover crops. You'll see some buckwheat blooming on the left. All these tunnels are 30 by 72, 4-foot bow spacing, and the important thing for us here today is that they have 2 layers of poly. That influences the heat retention in the wintertime, so we're talking about getting somewhere between 5 to 7 degrees of warmth additionally at night compared to outside temperatures. And we've got 6-foot roll-up sides for increased ventilation, and those big doors you see on the end are about 8 by 8. So what are we growing? We're growing a diversity of crops, as I mentioned. Each tunnel at any given time has 8 beds. Half of those beds are filled with a typical high-value tunnel crop like tomato, maybe peppers, strawberries, those kinds of things. And then about the other half, we're focused on crops that are diversify your market stand, and also to kind of where we're looking to diversify the local food marketplace. So leafy greens, legumes, and root vegetables that are appropriate to the season. So this time of year, for example, we have chards and kales and lettuces, and in terms of legumes, in the past we've planted fava beans, and we would be getting ready to plant some peas normally. Root vegetables would be carrots, salad, turnips, beets, those kinds of things appropriate to the season. We do rotate in each bed as best we can, and we try to keep 1 year between botanical families. And I point this out because the pictures that you're going to see here in a moment have an awful lot of bright colors on them, and they are, and that's because each crop is listed by botanical family. All right, so this is a terrible slide in that you can't probably read anything, but I'm just going to, this is the big picture, and we're going to narrow in on the smaller picture as we go. So what we see here, and again, I want you to focus on those colors rather than the text itself. So you can see that we go from, for example, that first line on the top box that says fall, that's strawberries. It's in the Rosaceae family. So you can see we carry those strawberries through the winter, and then we rotate out to a solanaceous crop like peppers. That rotation is not hard and fast. We basically just try not to put solanaceous crops on top of each other. We try to give them at least a year in between. Sometimes we do better than others. So I'm gonna, in the next few slides, I'm gonna go through each season in our high tunnels. I'm gonna offer you some planting dates that have worked for us, but I also wanna point out again that these are very location and microclimate specific. These will get you in the ballpark, but what will work on your farm, you'll have to experiment with. All right, so this is a picture of high tunnels in the late fall, and in here you can see we've got strawberries in a couple of beds, some hybrid tomatoes going in. We don't do heirloom tomatoes in the fall because they are take too many days to maturity. We have to plant them quite early. The pest pressure is also fairly high, so we've actually gotten away from doing organic tomatoes in the fall because we do end up with a lot of worm pressure, and our field tomatoes do carry quite a while. So that's one thing that we've given up out of this rotation, but pretty much everything else still holds true. We do carrots, you can do beets, head lettuce, cooking greens. The main items to point out here is that we're looking at transplanting most of our leafy greens and our strawberries by about the middle of September. For smaller scale growers, it can actually be a little bit difficult to get a hold of a small quantity of strawberries that early in the season, so you'll really want to think about sourcing those early if you want to do strawberries. And I'd be happy to field questions about that crop specifically, or any of these crops specifically at a later time. I'm just going to kind of give you the broad brush overview and what our timing looks like. So we're looking at direct seeding a lot of those fall crops sometime between really the 1st of September and October 15th. Anything that we're direct seeding, so carrots, beets, salad mixes, things like that, tend to slow down quite a bit for us, and we get poorer germination after about October 15th. But if you're going much before September 1st, it is awfully hot in the high tunnel, and it's quite difficult to get those crops to germinate. So we're kind of looking for a sweet spot in the early to mid-fall in order to get those crops well established so that they can grow through the winter, and in some cases, for example, like with carrots, to get them up to size so that you could continually harvest off of them all winter long. All right, here's a picture also later in the winter. So we see we're carrying some of those same crops over. Those strawberries that we transplanted in September are still there, so taking up an awful lot of real estate in those tunnels. Our carrots are still there. Our head lettuces have gone in to replace another crop, and you can see that it says they're transplanted November 30th. So we're actually able to transplant lettuces all winter long. That's kind of our go-to crop. When we pull something out of the tunnels, we've harvested our carrots or our beets or even other lettuces, we prepare a 4 to 6 week transplant and pop those back in place. And we're basically just looking for a 3 to 4 day window where the night temperatures are not going to be much below freezing to pop those back in. And then we're looking at anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks to get that crop to maturity, just depending on how sunny it is and the temperature outside. But that's kind of our go-to to fill that crop niche between when one thing comes out and when another goes in. You can see our cooking greens are still there. I will make a comment about cooking greens, and by cooking greens I mean kales of all varieties, Swiss chard, those kinds of things. We've had a lot of questions about how those have survived these polar vortex of last year and the various cold weather snaps that we've had this year. And what we found in the past 2 or 3 years is that it isn't any one single freezing event that tends to knock these crops out. It's multiple freezing events combined with some high temperatures during the day. So when we start getting into the end of January and February, and we've had some real cold nights or even real cold days, and then sunny days that follow them. So the crop can really experience something like a 0 or even -5 Fahrenheit temperature, and then sunny the next day, the high tunnel can swing up to 50 or 60 degrees, sometimes even into the 70s if we don't get them vented very quickly. That's a 75-degree flux at some points during the day, and that's when we start to see issues with crop decline. So it isn't any one single event that tends to knock these crops out unless they're really small. It's multiple freezing events, and then once it starts to get warm, the plants are stressed, and kales especially begin to bolt. So we're actually now, the 10th of March, looking to tear out the majority of our greens that we planted in the fall in order to do some spring planted greens, just because crops are starting to decline a little bit. Let's see what else on here. We have some spinach and arugula that was seeded in the middle of November. Again, it depends on the kind of year that you get. Spinach is a long germinating crop. It takes a little while to pop out of the ground. If it's a cold year, that spinach can sit there for an awfully long time. The year that we had a good luck with this, doing that late, we got really lucky, and it was relatively warm and sunny that winter. So it just kind of depends on what your weather looks like. But again, our kind of rule of thumb is we'll direct seed about anything that we direct seed. So some of those leafy greens like spinach and arugula, salad mixes, and root vegetables from September really until about October 15th. And then it kind of depends on the year. The only last thing I want to say about this slide and about winter growing in general is the differences between high tunnel growing in the south versus the north. So I like to say that Kentucky is culturally southern but climatically midwestern in terms of the weather patterns that we experience in the winter time. So what you often see with high tunnel growers in the further deep south is that they can continue to grow crops through the winter. So they can plant something and get it to maturity in relatively short amount of time. What we tend to see northern high tunnel growers doing is establishing a crop early and getting it to maturity to around Thanksgiving or between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and then they'll pick off that crop, whether it's a root vegetable or leafy greens, through the depths of winter, and then often we'll experience what we experience, some crop decline with these repeated frost and warming cycles, and then we'll replace it. We'll then replant in the spring. If that makes sense? So we conservatively manage our high tunnels like northern tunnel growers, but we occasionally get a southern winter here that allows our crops to mature really fast, and that's when we go ahead and tuck in extra lettuce plants and things like that. All right, spring has come in this slide, and Miranda was asking me what this big bushy looking plant in the middle of the high tunnel is. That was actually fava beans. So I was curious to see if we could get those to go here. Further south, you can grow them in years where it doesn't get too warm too fast. We had fantastic luck with fava beans. I will say they're an interesting story of growing in a diversified tunnel setting. So we've got those fava beans right next to those strawberries that you've seen in previous slides. So strawberries tend to be a little susceptible to spider mites in particular. And again, this is an organic setting, so we don't have great organic controls. And although we had a great fava bean crop, it was also a fantastic incubator for spider mites. And so we had spider mites move from the favas to the strawberries, and we ended up ripping out our favas just as fast as we could get them picked, even though I would have liked to incorporate them as a green manure, because we have tomatoes immediately next to those. So you really have to be careful when you're managing these systems that you don't have pest problems jump from one to another. And that's one thing that we do see is aphid and spider mite pressure on those legumes grown in their late winter, early spring, and they can jump to things that can be a real problem for you, like your tomatoes. So in spring here, we see the majority of our winter stuff has come out. The strawberries we replaced with peppers, transplanting those around June 1st. Peppers have been, that's awfully late for a high tunnel planting, but the peppers can tolerate the heat of summertime and do well and carry into the fall. So that's been a good rotation for us, going from strawberries into peppers. We've done both specialty reds and green bells, and equal success with those, and much higher yields than in the field. We've got some hybrid tomatoes in there. Beets, again, carrots seeded again. So about the middle of March, right about now, is when we start thinking about putting in those crops. We're seeding our beets out in the high tunnels this week, in fact. All right, and those crops basically carry through the summertime. So now I'm going to kind of talk in general about lessons that we've learned in terms of how to manage the diversified high tunnel as optimizing kind of your high value real estate. And one key thing here, if you're a field-based grower, is that you can really pack the plants in a high tunnel setting. So this is high value real estate in that you've paid $5,000 for this structure, or at least put an awful lot of labor into getting the structure up. And so what we typically try to do is pack the plants in just as tight as we can to get as high a yields out as possible. So spacings that have worked well for us are greens and head lettuces on 12 inches both within and between the row. So our beds are about 30 inches wide at the base, about 24 by the time you get to the top of the bed. They're just ever so slightly raised, and then about a foot in between. So on a 30 by 72 high tunnel, we're talking about 8 beds that are about 2.5 feet wide with about a foot in between. That's a little bit tight working space. But we kind of want to maximize the space in the tunnel, so get away with just as little path space as possible. So for us, that means for our head lettuces, 3 rows wide on a 24 to 30 inch bed, and then running down the length of the row. And some growers will pack them in tighter than that, but that's about what we can handle and not be down on our hands and knees weeding. So that is also a really important consideration, is to consider how you're going to weed before you plant. So a lot of folks, we tend to think of these tunnels sometimes, especially if you only have one, we tend to think of them as kind of a large scale garden, but it's an awfully large area to be on your hands and knees weeding if you've taken out the ability for you to be able to stand up with a hoe or something like that, because you packed in the spacing so tight. So you do have to kind of take into account how you're going to do that. What we typically do is take the width of our narrowest hoe on the farm, and we use a hula hoe or a scuffle hoe that's about 4 inches wide. So we try to keep about 4 inches between row spacing, so that we're not down on our hands and knees. That's kind of what we've settled on to make peace with the crew. If I had it my way, in some cases I would space things just a little bit tighter, especially with root vegetables. So our root vegetables, we space about 4 to 6 inches apart between rows, and then just normal in row spacing, 1 inch or 2 apart, depending on the crop. So we're looking at anywhere between 4 to 6 rows on a 24 to 36 inch bed. There are growers like Elliott Coleman who would maybe even put 8 rows on a bed that tight, but that does limit you to hand weeding. So again, it depends on how you're planning on managing that system. And Dr. Bill Hoyt probably has some good suggestions for us on potential ways to mechanize at some point, or he'd be kind of a go-to person to be thinking about that. Then just to put in print here what I had said in the previous slide about thinking about windows for good germination. So basically we're looking at February to June for most of our crops. I'm going to move to the next slide here. For most of our crops, February to June, for anything that's direct seeded, and then September to November. And our direct seeded crops, again, are root vegetables and then things like salad mixes. We pretty much transplant about anything that we can transplant. And the reason for that is we're trying to get our crops in and out as fast as possible. So if you can avoid the time that it takes for that crop to germinate and get up to size by transplanting it, it can save you a few weeks. And you'll be able to flip that bed faster. So what we're trying to do in these diversified systems is get a crop in, get a crop out, and just keep flipping these crops through as rapidly as possible for things like lettuce mixes and root vegetables and things like that. Again, only along the lines of this being valuable real estate, you don't want to have skips on your seeds. So what we have come to do is seed pretty heavy and thin later. There are various ways to seed. I put a couple of pictures up here. I know some high tunnel growers that still, even if they have a half dozen high tunnels, they are absolutely obsessed about their carrots and getting good germination. They will still use hand tap seeders for carrots. But we have gotten away from that entirely, and we use anything from earthway seeders to this picture on the lower right is a Jang seeder that our high tunnel manager really likes. We picked that up last year, and he's had really good luck with it singulating both large and small seeds. So we've got good, that's kind of been the direction that we've gone. It's a little bit of an economic step up from an earthway seeder, but it does a nice job on those small seeded crops. And again, we do transplant a lot of lettuces in the wintertime, Asian greens, etc., throughout the winter. So we try to find things that we can pop in and get out relatively quickly when we have crops finishing up, but before we get into the middle of March to early April when we're thinking about putting in our spring crops for summer harvest. I just want to, since the title of this slide includes irrigation, I just wanted to mention kind of how we manage irrigation on the tunnels that I manage. And this is, we keep it pretty simple, and that's with the use of tensiometers or watermark sensors. So basically, all we're doing is putting a couple of emitters into our beds and just watering when we get to about 40 centibars. We've learned a lot in both on the farm and working with other growers on other high tunnel water management projects in that folks tend to overwater. So tensiometers can be a little bit of a pain to establish. They do sell them at produce supply places. You can get them here locally. They are a little bit of a pain in that if you kick them, they can lose their soil to soil contact with the ceramic tip, but once you get used to them, they can really help you calibrate your watering, and you may not have to use them forever. So we've had good luck using tensiometers both on the farm and working with other growers. The other piece that I want to mention is that we've had really good luck reusing drip tape in the tunnels because they are not as exposed to the elements and not applied at such a large scale. So a lot of times actually we'll take leftovers from the field where they've had, they don't need an extra 70 feet or so on the end of their run, and we can recycle it by using it in the tunnel. We do try to wash down our drip tape and soak it in 10% bleach solution for just a small amount of time. We do the same thing with landscape fabric. So that's one thing that I don't have a slide of on here. But we use a little bit of plastic mulch, but we use a lot of landscape fabric in our organic tunnels, and we reuse that between crops. It is a significant one-time investment, but John is going to talk about that again. But with some cleaning in between cycles, we found it to be a nice way to get rid of at least some of the plastic use. Okay, and then the only other thing that I'd like to mention in regards to kind of overall management of the tunnels is Diversified setting can make things a little bit complicated at transition times like now, in the middle of March, or when you're starting to plant your summer crops, but your cool season crops haven't totally finished. So you kind of have to prioritize who are you managing the temperature for? Are you managing it for your tomatoes that would like it a little bit warmer, or are you managing it for your cool season crops like strawberries that might be in there, or leafy greens and those kinds of things? So if you have several high tunnels on the farm and you want to run a diversified kind of operation, you're much better off creating zones. So cool season house and a warm season house or something like that. It does get a little bit difficult, and you have to kind of optimize for the whole tunnel rather than maximize for any one crop if you want to keep them all going. So you really need to prioritize which one you're managing. So for us at this time of year, where you might still have some greens in that were planted in the fall, but we're getting ready to plant our tomatoes, we absolutely prioritize our tomatoes, because those are going to be the crops that carry us in. They're into the future, and they are relatively high value. So that's just one example of what I mean by prioritizing which crops you're managing for. Okay, and you can just see a picture of that diversified setup here, and to give you another example, for example, a cool season crop like fava beans there in the middle, which we don't grow very often, but when we do, it is a temperature management issue. Do we pick them, or do we pick the tomatoes? In this case, we also pick the tomatoes. Okay, so I'm not going to talk too much about movable rotations, but just to give you a little bit of an overview of how this works, what you can see in this overview shot from the farm, this aerial shot, if you look at the high tunnel on the lower right, you can see immediately to its left, it looks like there's something growing in the field, and there is. So that was the crop that the high tunnels were actually moved off of. So what we're doing is we're moving the heat to or from the crops that we want. So in the fall, for example, we'll establish greens in the field around the 1st of August, or maybe up until the middle of August, when it's way too hot to be planting greens in high tunnels. But then come middle of September to the 1st of October, we'll move the high tunnels over the top of that crop that's grown in the open field. So we're moving the heat to the crop, and then after that crop has finished and the tunnel has moved off of it, it allows us to cover crop and allow rain to fall through. So that's just kind of our general overview, is we move the heat to or from the crop, and there are many iterations of ways you can run this on your farm. So in the past, we've run 2 moves per year. So we do for a move earlier in June, we move them to their summer position. So basically what this allows us to do is to get our summer crops established and get them some early heat at this point, where if our tomatoes aren't fruiting, they're getting awfully close. And then we're getting the heat off of those crops, and we're moving into we'll move them, and then we'll plant some really heat tolerant crops like cucumbers, peppers, and eggplants. And then we'll move the tunnel again into its winter or spring position around the middle of September. And our cue is generally when we have we pick our crop that's going to be most sensitive, that really needs to be under the tunnel. And so in a lot of years when we grow strawberries, it's when we transplant our strawberries, because we want to protect those as much as possible and get some early growth on them. So that's kind of our cue for moving. We've since moved away from this summer move, and we keep the high tunnels in place for a full year. And the main reason we're doing that is our tomatoes just get decimated in an organic setting when you take them from under plastic to exposed to the elements. So they are not well hardened off, and they tend to succumb to disease fairly quickly, even with spraying organic fungicides. So we've decided to just leave them in place and then move in September. But that still gives us, that means that tunnel with 3 positions will not return to that spot for 2 years. So that gives us 1 year of cropping and 2 years of cover cropping. So it gives us a lot of time for that soil to recover and salts to leach out, and use of cover crops to break weed cycles and things like that. Cover crops that we use in this rotation, our go-to is clover and wheat, and/or vetch and wheat. That's a little bit different than vetch and rye, which we usually see in this part of the country. And that's because we're managing these with a BCS Walk-Behind Tractor that John Wilhoit's going to talk about in a little bit. The rye is a tremendous amount of biomass, and our Flail Mower has a little bit of a hard time keeping up with it. But if you would be mowing cover crops with a a larger mower, you wouldn't have a problem with that at all. In summertime, it depends on how much time we have before the frost comes. If we have just a short window after those crops come out, we look at using cowpea and millet. We can get a decent amount of biomass, between 30 and 45 days there. And if we have a plot that's going to be open all summer long, so one that has not had the tunnel on it and will not have it on there, we usually plant Sudex, a sorghum Sudan grass hybrid. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is an example of a year-round harvest system. And again, I want to emphasize that these planting dates are going to vary based on your location. And what this also does not account for is succession planting. So if you're a market grower and you always want to have carrots at the farmer's market, you're going to need to be planting more than just that, that single date that you see up here. So every 2 weeks, for example, something like that. So these are all kind of one-off plantings and then the subsequent harvest windows. But what you're seeing here is that we're spreading harvest throughout the year. So so we've got our our traditional tomatoes there at the bottom that we're harvesting from May to the 1st of September, but we're also harvesting some crops all the way from January forward. So salad mixes could be harvested essentially year-round, except for when it's quite warm. You see we've got a variety of beans in there, and we're both spreading the income as well as spreading the labor here. So put that up there just as kind of a general example based on our data. But you could see that if you were planting under a staggered or successional planting scenario, a lot more of those green bars would be filled, okay, if that makes sense. The other thing to point out here, you're probably, if you're looking at this closely, you're probably looking at those last columns there, the gross income per 100 square feet, and then gross income per 100 square feet per month. I want to make a couple of introductory comments about this here. So these are based on Kentucky Farmers Market reports, and it's an average from statewide markets from the earliest date that a lot of these products are available. So for example, there were no farmers markets reporting carrot sales in March and April, and so we had to use the June and July numbers. So these are extremely conservative examples, and they are not, even though we manage organically, these are not for organic. These are not organic prices. These are general prices averaged all over the state for conventional production. And I wanted to be conservative about this. I didn't want to overstate income. And again, this is gross, not net. So this does not account for any input costs. Okay, this is just based on sales. So as you look down, you'll see that the income is based on, or returns is based on 100 square foot basis, and that's I didn't want to do it on a per bed basis because there are many configurations for bed space. So rather would use total area. And what you see here as being some pretty high value crops, of course, heirloom and hybrid tomatoes bringing in a fair amount of money. But interesting to note, so are those peppers. Remember, those peppers were planted quite late. That's a June planted high tunnel pepper, and it's still bringing in a good bit of money. So that's coming in after a crop. So that's not going in when you would normally try to push the season. That's just demonstrative of how heat tolerant peppers are and how much they can benefit from being grown in a tunnel versus an open field environment due to some of the control of the abiotic factors that you have in a high tunnel. Some other high value crops that pop out there that may not be grown a lot of the time, carrots are very high value, as well as assorted greens, and those are coming at times where you may not necessarily have that summer income coming in. So you can feel free to interpret those numbers how you like and for what would work for your farm, but those are just that's just a snapshot based on 1 year of data from us and a fairly conservative farmers market report data. Okay, and then I'm just going to comment very briefly. I'm going to shift gears here and just mention organic nutrient management. And so this is pretty much our general nutrient management plan for all of the crops on the farm. Or all the crops in the high tunnels. We do fertigate with organic fertilizer for after foliar testing on tomatoes, sometimes with peppers and sometimes with strawberries. Kind of just depends on the year. We almost always do for tomatoes, we start every bed with this mix here. So we start with the equivalent of 10 tons per acre of compost, which based on our tests of that compost is the equivalent of about 40 pounds per acre of nitrogen. If you calculate that compost as releasing its nutrients over a 10-year time period, then we supplement that with an organic 5-4-3. That's just a pelletized poultry manure granular fertilizer at about 60 pounds per acre. So we basically put about 100 pounds per acre in each of those beds pre-plant. If we've had a cover crop in there, we'll adjust based on the biomass of that crop. There are some guides out there to help you do that. That's pretty uncommon. So basically, our good rule of thumb for us is, for our size, we put down 5 buckets of compost and 5 pounds of that organic fertilizer goes in each bed. The overall thinking for this is that we are trying not to use compost to meet our nitrogen need. When you do that, it's overkill on the phosphorus. You will way overshoot your phosphorus application, and you can start, because compost can also have a lot of salts associated with them, not just sodium, but a lot of potassium and calcium and magnesium. You can really get some weird stuff going on if you're overloading your high tunnels with compost. So we tend to use compost as a soil amendment and account for it in terms of its nitrogen and phosphorus contributions, and then use granular fertilizers and fertigate on top of that. The reason we're incorporating compost is because we're removing a lot, we're tilling really heavily, and we're removing a lot of crop residues out of the tunnels. So we're mining a lot of the soil carbon. So we want to put some back, but we don't want to use it as the basis of our fertility program. And then the last little piece I want to say here is, again, kind of hitting home, don't go crazy on the compost organic growers. And this is something I hear from my colleagues at the soils meetings every year. And compost is a great fertilizer and it's a great soil amendment, but can create some serious problems. So sometimes when folks are setting up high tunnels, they'll also do a one-time application. So there was a study that was done out of Penn State where they looked at an initial setup on a high tunnel where there was an inch of compost applied. And what that worked out to, if you assume that compost releases its nitrogen on par at a rate of about 10% per year, that was over 400 pounds of nitrogen in a given year. And that is not only going to overload your plants, it's going to create bullish growth on your tomatoes and things like that. And not to mention can throw your salts way out of whack if there's anything else in that compost that you're not aware of. So beware of those one-time humongous applications that sometimes folks want to do when they're setting up a high tunnel. And the other thing is to account for, or at least be cognizant of, the legacy of regular compost application. So you might think that we're a little shy on the nutrients with just putting down 100 pounds of nitrogen pre-plant for in organic forms that release more slowly for peppers and things, and tomatoes and things like that. But remember, we're growing a couple crops per year in these diversified year-round settings, and so we're applying that 10 tons per acre before every single crop. And so we've got a legacy effect of some of that compost. Unfortunately, we don't really know how much. There are not great rules of thumb for that, and so much of the nutrient availability from organic amendments is based on temperature and moisture and microbial activity. And there's no great rule of thumb. We don't have great control over those factors. And so we just try to be real mindful of what we're putting in, and then if we're not sure if we have the fertility, to foliar test on the crops that we have good information about. And if you have any questions, of course, we can chat a little bit about after this webinar in the Q&A session, but you can always reach me here in the office at my office number there and via email. So with that, I think I'll hand it over to Dr. John Wilhoit.
Okay, thank you, Krista.
Yep, there you go.
Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about some considerations for using equipment inside of high tunnels. Obviously, there are a lot of space limitations for using conventional tractors and equipment. And so, as Krista mentioned, for a lot of high tunnels, there's the option of using the walk-behind tractors, small two-wheel tractors. So I'm going to talk a bit about those. Also, another limitation or constraint for using equipment has to do with the bed spacing. And it's particularly for the type of production that Krista was going through with diversified, intensive production inside of high tunnels, then you are going to end up with some constraints in terms of getting equipment in there. Now, you can use some compact tractors in high tunnels if you've got access, if you've got the end wall set up that'll allow you to get a tractor in there. Obviously, there are constraints as to what sort of operations you're going to be able to do, particularly after a crop is established in terms of spacing and the beds. But compact tractors can be an option. They're most likely to be useful for you for initial soil preparation, the primary tillage, primary and secondary tillage for preparing the soil in the first place. For the type of production that Krista was going through with diversified operations, you're more likely not to be able to use a compact tractor. If you are interested in compact tractors, there's a couple of good publications out there that I like to recommend to people. These come out of LSU AgCenter. They've got both of these publications are available online. The first one is Compact Tractors, Selection, Use, and Safety, and that one can be accessed at the web link that's shown here, and that can be downloaded directly online. They have a second one on implements for compact tractors. It's also a good publication. This one is not necessarily still available from the LSU AgCenter website, but it is available from some other websites, maybe at a cost. But as I mentioned, particularly for intensive diversified production in tunnels, you're likely not to be able to use a high tunnel. Frankly, a lot of what you're going to do is going to be manual work, but one thing that can be very useful is the walk-behind tractors. So I'm going to spend a bit of time just going over some stuff on walk-behind tractors. These are two-wheel tractors that we're talking about, essentially like a larger scale Roto-Tiller, but and there are some older model two-wheel tractors, the Graveleys from many years ago, but primarily what we're seeing now are these newer models from European manufacturers, primarily out of Italy, in particular two brands, BCS and Grillo. These are tractors. They're very nicely designed, can do lots of different things with them. Power range, 5.5 up to about 18 horsepower. Prices ranging from somewhere $2,000 to $6,000. Those numbers may be a little bit old, but so it might be a little higher now, but that's for the base tractor itself. Now, there's a lot of attachments that can be used with these walk-behind tractors, and actually those can get a little pricey. So, you know, if you get a wide range of attachments for a lot of different things, then you can still end up spending a good bit of money on this system. But anyway, it's a good option for working inside of tunnels. I will mention in particular, they do make a plastic layer for these walk-behind tractors. They'll only do a 3-foot wide roll of plastic, not the 4-foot wide that we usually use in the field. And they do use a special roll of drip tape, 1,000-foot rolls of drip tape. And I guess one of the main things too is they will not lay plastic on a raised bed. They'll only do a flat bed. So that's a particular consideration. Now, yes, in this slide, we actually have a good source for walk-behind tractors in Kentucky, Earth Tools near Frankfort. So I'll just put their contact information up there. They're a dealer and have a great experience, many years selling these and servicing with the walk-behind tractors. So real good resource there. So I want to spend a bit of time going through these walk-behind tractors and attachments in detail and their use in high tunnels. I don't actually have a great deal of experience with these myself, but so I've contacted Aaron Stancombe, who manages the high tunnels at the UK Research Farm, and he's got a great amount of experience. And I actually got some video footage of Aaron going through the use of these tractors and talking about their some of the attachments and their use in the high tunnels. I can't show the videos linked to the link sites, but if you go to the if you're interested and would like to play the videos while I'm talking, you can reach the links of the YouTube videos, and I will tell which video to play while I'm talking. We'll see if we can work this out. I'm going to play the video myself I'm going to kind of time this, so in case anybody is watching the video, then I'll talk through it. If you want to listen to Aaron, I'm going to be trying to talk about what Aaron is going over, but if you can watch the video yourself and listen to Aaron, that probably, you get a lot out of that. I don't know if you can listen to both of us, but we'll see. Okay. So to start with, let's see. Okay, so the walk-behind tractor, as you see in the slide here, this is the BCS brand, and these are real nicely designed machines. Just point out if I can. Okay.
Just click it right there. Now the green arrow. Is it there? No. You might not
Okay,
know
well,
that, sorry.
Okay, anyway, what we see here is the BCS walk-behind tractor with wheel extensions on it, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then you see the handlebars, and I want to point out one thing about the walk-behind tractor is that the handlebars are reversible, and also you can see the point of attachment for hooking implements to the walk-behind tractor, and it's also with a PTO drive. And so some attachments we'll use on the front of the tractor, like the Flail Mower. Others we would use to the rear, like a Roto-Tiller. And the handlebars can actually be reversed depending on the implement that you're using. The wheel extensions I mentioned, Aaron uses these wheel extensions to space the wheels out far enough so that the wheels are actually in the walking paths between the beds, and that is going to minimize the compaction in the bed itself. Okay, this first implement is a Rotary Plow. This is a unique tool for the walk-behind tractors. It's it's a vertical axis tiller, and it really does a good job. That you can take this Rotary Plow into sod, and it'll break brand new sod in a single pass, and that's not something you can do with an ordinary Roto-Tiller. But one thing about it, it only does a narrow about 8 to 10 inches, and so it's pretty tough to work a very big plot of ground just using this Rotary Plow. But what it does do is it throws the soil to one side, so it's very good for raising a bed, and it's used for that a lot. Okay, this is the Flail Mower. This is what I mentioned goes on the front of the tractor, and that's used for chopping cover crops or residues. Does a good job. Here's the Roto-Tiller. We'll mention that the Roto-Tiller for the BCS it's very heavy duty, and it's going to be stronger than standard homeowner Roto-Tiller. Does a good job. This is a toolbar that can mount to the BCS with hilling discs on it, and we'll talk some more about that. Other tools can be mounted on a toolbar with the BCS as well. And then finally, this is the plastic layer that I mentioned before. As Krista mentioned, they don't actually, at the UK Hort Farms, Research Farm, they don't tend to use the plastic covering the bed. Instead, they use the landscape fabric, and I'm going to talk a little more about that in a minute. Okay, the next video that, in case you're trying to watch at home, or I'm sorry, at the LinkedIn site, is going to be a video Aaron in the tunnel with raised beds. And so Aaron, this slide shows Aaron using the hilling discs to raise a bed. And this is something that I've been trying lately, kind of a new thing, that using the hilling discs this way. And let's see, I'm sorry, I think I've mentioned the wrong video. This is another video of Aaron in the tunnel talking about how they do the beds. And so here, this is following the use of the disc bedders, and this is a bed that's used the hilling discs, raised bed, and then Aaron is raking the bed to prepare a seed bed, kind of raking out some of the trash, as he called it, from the previous crop, which was kale in this case. So he's preparing a seed bed, flattening it out, and preparing it for seeding into. And then Aaron describes the sequence of the operations that he did to prepare the bed. First thing he did was to use a chisel plow, and the chisel plow it shatters the soil, and it helps break up any deep compaction. Following the use of the chisel plow, then the Roto-Tiller was used to till the soil, and then finally the use of those hilling discs to raise the bed. So that's a typical sequence that he's been using to prepare a bed in the high tunnel. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk about was the use of this landscape fabric that Krista mentioned. And again, there's another video if you are trying to watch the videos on Aaron with plastic versus fabric and the flamer demo. So Aaron here has some landscape fabric rolled out in front of him, and as Krista mentioned, they like to use landscape fabric instead of black plastic mulch. There's some good advantages to using landscape fabric, and one thing about the landscape fabric, as Krista mentioned, it can be reused. So it's also, they find it easier to work with, to cover the beds with it. As far as reusing it, there is a sanitation issue, as Krista mentioned, and they will clean the landscape fabric using either a pressure washer with a bleach solution, or they'll actually soak the rolls themselves in bleach solution inside something like a watering trough that's big enough to hold it. And another thing about the ease of use with this is they'll put this landscape fabric down using sod staples, and that's easier to do than covering the edges of plastic with soil like you typically do with the plastic mulch. There's just a close-up of a sod staple used to hold the fabric down. Here you can see Aaron with an old piece of landscape fabric, old as in from a previous season, and you can see the holes that have been cut through it, the planting holes, and obviously, if you are using landscape fabric, if you're reusing it, you've got to put planting holes in there, but and you'd want to keep track of the plants, the hole spacing, and grow a similar crop that'll use a similar hole spacing from the season before. Another thing with the planting holes is it's better if you can burn holes in the fabric so that the edges of the hole won't unravel, because it is a fabric. So Aaron has actually developed an attachment to a flame weeder for use in burning holes in landscape fabric. This is the flame weeder unit. It's a backpack propane burner used for flame weeding. And then Aaron has fabricated a special end to the flame weeder for burning these holes. This is actually was fabricated using, I think it's like a muffler pipe, and there's some details in the video about how this is made. And this is affixed to the end, and the pipe itself is heated up and then pressed into the landscape fabric to burn the hole through it. And there you can see the hole left in the landscape fabric. And Aaron would do this for spaced holes using the appropriate spacing for whatever crop was planned in this landscape fabric. And the heat from melting through the fabric singes the fibers and melts them together. So that's why it helps with as far as unraveling. And finally, the hole burning attachment. Aaron describes how this was made. One thing you'll see there in the middle is a cross of curved pieces of metal, and this actually serves to divert the flame, to push the heat out to the cylinder to heat it up. Also, you can see on here the bolts. They actually welded nuts onto the side of the cylinder, and then the 3 bolts there are used to tighten the cylinder onto the flame weeder. So that's all I've got to say. If you get a chance to watch those videos, you can get some better detail and descriptions of Aaron himself talking about it.
Thank you, John. Now we're going to move on to shoe bins.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few different things from my experiences over the last few years working in high tunnels. So a few different topics I'll try to touch on, and I'll talk about a few example crops as well. But I'll cover ground preparation, fertilizer and irrigation, and like I said, a few different crops I'll talk about. So as John mentioned earlier, certainly one of the considerations in a high tunnel is, what you're capable of getting into the structure. And the structures that I've worked in the past and the ones that I'm building currently at the Horticultural Research Farm, they have roll-up end wall doors. You can see them in this slide currently. They're 16 feet wide and 9 feet in height. So you can get a fairly good sized tractor. And the one you see pictured there is a 35 horse tractor. And even with the rollover protection system, otherwise known as the ROPS, you can still drive through that opening and make clearance of the opening of the door. But for our initial ground preparation, we're using a small disc. It's about 6 feet in width. This is actually just a small disc that might have been used to plant some plots for deer. This is something that we bought at Tractor Supply. It was roughly around $600. So it is some investment, but it wasn't overly expensive. In my opinion. You also see there pictured, we've got some old tractor weights strapped to it to add some additional weight so the disc will actually start cutting in a little bit better. Next in the ground preparation, we were using a reverse time tiller, 6 foot in width. You can see it's making, when we're moving that slowly, you can see it's really pulverizing and making a really fine bed. And the other thing to note is, you can see even with this large piece of equipment, a 35 horse tractor, we folded down the ROPS because we're close to the sidewall now where the bows are. But you can see there I'm actually only about 4 inches, maybe a little bit tighter to that sidewall. I'm not having really any issues. Now, as you approach the end wall that I'm headed towards in this direction, you will have to start cutting out a little bit. And again, with implements on the back end of the tractor, as you cut left, it's cutting right. So that's going to swing into the sidewall. But that particular implement right now isn't near as long as what you'll see in a moment with the plastic layer. So you can get a little bit further closer to the end wall with this as opposed to something you'll see in a moment. What we found though was the tiller really didn't work deep enough for us in this soil. So we brought out an older piece of equipment. I'd say this is well exceeding me in years, but it's been well maintained by this particular gentleman using it right now. Good working condition, and we're using some cultivators under the belly. And if you notice there, he's standing actually on top of the toolbar, trying to drive it down just a little bit deeper, but it really worked up the soil for us. And in years following this initial soil preparation, we actually quit using our tiller and solely used the disc, and then used this old Allis-Chalmers G. So after we've prepared the soil in our high tunnel for planting, certainly there are all different options for broadcasting that fertilizer. But in this case, we have a Gandy applicator. You can see that our high tunnels, or maybe I failed to mention, the high tunnels I was working in are 30 feet wide and 96 feet in length. So again, being 30 foot wide, we actually happen to have a fertilizer applicator for dry material that's got a 15 foot wide boom. We can make a pass down one side and come down the other, and we've essentially been able to put out our broadcast fertilizer. But I've also used other methods like a hand spreader and also a drop spreader. But sometimes the drop spreaders aren't as uniform in the way they drop fertilizer. So as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the implements you certainly need to be cautious about as you approach that end wall, as you see as he is now, because again, as you cut to his right, that plastic layer is going to swing to the left. But what I will say about this is I've laid plastic by hand, and I know maybe some of you have done so as well. And generally speaking, when you lay it by hand, you don't get quite as nice of a bed as you see here. And even though he has to cut out a little bit early, it leaves us with only forming maybe 4 or 5 feet of bed by hand as opposed to 96 feet, and then multiply that by the number of rows that you'd be laying. The other thing that I'll point out is with this implement, you're actually making a raised bed. And so raised beds are really beneficial for vegetable production, are really important. And one of the things, you might not consider or think about, you say, well, rain's not a problem because I'm in a high tunnel. But depending on where you built that high tunnel, it's just like any other building. So that rain is still going to fall, and where is it going to go as it rolls off those sides? And I've seen it in many instances where it rolls into the high tunnel itself, and it moves by capillary action through the soil. And I've seen pooling and ponding water in structures. And so that raised bed actually gives you some benefits because it prevents you from those roots getting wet. But this particular plastic layer we're looking at, this is made by a Buckeye tractor. It looks pretty much essentially like what we would use in the field. The only difference is this is about 12 to 18 inches narrower than a typical field version. And that extra, or rather the reduction in width certainly helps in maneuverability in the structure. But in this particular one, it's actually about as long as a traditional field plastic layer. But I've come across some newer ones which are much more compact even. So we talk about planting briefly. In an open field, I would typically use a water wheel setter transplanting into black plastic mulch. But in this case, most water wheel setters that people have are going to require larger than a 35 horsepower tractor to operate. Plus the clearance when you lift it on the 3-point hitch is likely not going to make it through the 9 foot. So we don't use a water wheel setter in the structure. We use a tape measure, as you can see here, to get our plant spacing. And then I was using an old tomato stake, a 1-inch, and then I sharpened one end of it to a point, and we're poking those on the necessary spacing given the crop. And we're actually using a 5-gallon bucket and a small cup to put in the starter solution, and then transplanting by hand. Something else I want to touch on, we haven't really talked about in the webinar series, is spraying. Regardless of whether you're in an organic or conventional system, there is possibility that you will spray some sort of product, whether it be a fungicide or an insecticide. And I've done a lot of work with trellising crops that grow very tall. When I'm trellising indeterminate tomatoes or cucumbers, as you'll see later, they can reach a height of 12 feet. And so oftentimes I see people trying to use a backpack sprayer and a high tunnel to make applications. And in that situation, it's really hard to get good penetration into the canopy and get good uniform application. And plus, you also have to think about the safety of the applicator, because when you're spraying it with that backpack sprayer, there's oftentimes drift coming right back on top of your head. So what this sprayer allows you to do is it separates the applicator a little bit from the spray and moving in the direction, so it keeps them out of the drift a little bit. But it makes the spraying more efficient. It's going to get better coverage. And this is a sprayer that we just built ourselves with the help of a local welding business. But what we've got is we've got the axle system and pull handle from a greenhouse cart. We purchased that directly through Gemplers, and you can buy that without the decking and just the axles, wheels, and the handle. We got a piece of stainless steel, had it crimped on the sides to create our decking, bolted that to the axle. You can see that there's a battery box on the front of it close to the handle. We've got an onboard charger so we can charge the small motorcycle battery, which is going to operate the pump. The tank you see there is a 15-gallon tank that would typically go on the front end or the rear end of a four-wheeler or ATV. Usually that comes with tubing and hosing to have a gun-style applicator, and those usually are intended for herbicide applications, but we just replumbed it for our purposes. We created 9-foot booms that were made out of square aluminum piping, and we also hinged them. You might ask, why do you want to hinge those? Well, if you remember one of the images you saw earlier, I'd folded the ROPS down on the tractor because I was going to be bumping the bows as they start to bend down towards the ground post. And also, this is going to be spraying crop on either side of the sprayer. And so as you go down a row middle, you're spraying the half of each row as you go down, and we've got nozzles spaced at 20 inches. And we also have ball valves in place there because your crop isn't always at a height of 10 feet. It may only, at some point, it's only going to be at a foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, and so on and so forth. So we can shut off and on those nozzles as needed. But coming back to why we have it hinged, it's because you're going down one side that's on the outside wall, so you don't need spray going on that side because you'd just be spraying on the structure itself. And then also you need the clearance, because otherwise you'd be banging that one of those booms on the bows themselves or possibly poking holes in your plastic. And certainly nobody wants to be poking holes in your plastic. Lastly on this, again, we made it ourselves and fabricated it, but it cost us around $600-700 to put together. But I can assure you, my technician that used it, it was certainly a big improvement over a backpack sprayer, and actually helps again with some of the safety concerns for the applicator, whoever it may be. I don't want to spend too much time on this because there's going to be some later webinars talking about weed management, and John has also already mentioned some of the landscape fabric. So I am using plastic mulch, as you can see here is what's colored in black. For the rows, this is actually a trellis cucumber crop I have growing, but if you look in between the rows, I have landscape fabric. It just happens to be white. And so one of the things that I'll point out why we have the fabric is because that crop is going to be approaching 12 feet in height. Even some of the tallest people that may work in there are probably only going to be around 6 feet tall, maybe a little bit over, and you can only reach so far. So you've got to be able to get up into the top of that canopy. In order to do that, you need a ladder. And I don't know if any of you have ever tried to put a ladder on freshly tilled row middles that you use to manage your weeds, and that's not going to be very stable. And I know you can't see me, but I'm a fairly big guy, and that's not something that I really want to try. When I fall, I'm going to fall hard and probably take out half a row when I do so. That's not something else that you want to do. But it provides weed management, but the other thing some people may not recognize, it helps with disease management because it keeps inoculum, spores, sclerotia, those types of things from falling into the soil like you might experience with white mold or timber rot on tomatoes. And it allows you to sweep the floors, get all the plant debris out, as described earlier by some of the presenters. And it helps with sanitation. And using this in a system, I was able to avoid fungicide applications for 2 years consecutively on tomato crops. So it helps you with disease management, but it also helps you with light management. And so when you think about for a tomato crop that you might be transplanting early in the season when light levels tend to be low in the state of Kentucky or other areas in the Midwest, it's actually maximizing light and reflecting light back up into the canopy in the early season. And this is more anecdotal than anything, but I've had a grower who planted the same time, the same varieties as I did, didn't have fabric like this maximizing light, and they actually had shade cloth pulled at that time too, further reducing their light when we didn't have it pulled at that juncture in the season. And we were harvesting about 3 weeks earlier than they did. And so it has to do with, it comes back to light in my opinion, because we got to a flowering stage before that they did. Okay, so irrigation and fertilization, I'll be honest, it's a pretty broad topic. to cover, and certainly they're going to have specifics for individual crops. I'll focus on tomatoes as an example because it does tend to be the predominant crop in high tunnels currently. Whether you're in Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Illinois, it certainly predominates the high tunnel systems. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about some of my experiences, and talking about there's higher tech and lower tech, or higher investment or lower investment options for trying to automate your irrigation systems. And so what you can see in the lower left now, you see basically a control panel. That's an irrigation controller that's designed to water volumetrically. In the upper right hand corner, you're seeing the other working components of that system, which is a solenoid valve and also a water meter, which has a sensor on it. And so in my first season working with this system, I was actually watering much like many of the growers in the area were doing, by watering the tomato crop every couple of days. And if you looked at our soil test report, we had exceeding levels of calcium. So we had plenty of calcium available in the soil. Blossom end rot is something that I'll touch on just briefly later, but I'm sure if you've grown tomatoes, you're familiar with blossom end rot. And in that season when I was watering irregularly, when I had all the calcium that I could ever need, I had about 25% blossom end rot. So the following season, I started switching gears and going back to what I'd done previously when I was located in another state, and started trying to water more consistently, and was doing this on a volumetric basis because I knew tomatoes needed about half a gallon of water per day through research and through other colleagues that I've worked with. So based on the number of plants, I started to water volumetrically, and I made a significant change in that and was able to do so. And in the following season, I had less than 5% blossom end rot, and I had no calcium during that season. So just goes to show that consistent irrigation can certainly help you manage certain problems with tomato crops or other solanaceous vegetables, or even some of the cucurbits can be susceptible to blossom end rot as well. So now you may ask, well, how much does that system cost? Okay, and that's a very good question. That system, it cost about $2,500 to install, and that operated 3 30 by 96 foot structures. You could operate more structures from that controller and have several programs. So you could certainly see an investment like that would be worthy if you have a lot of structures and you wanted to have better management. But if you wanted to start with a little bit lower input cost up front, the two images on the right in the middle and then in the bottom are an image of a battery operated solenoid valve. That's something that I used to use in the open field when I worked in Florida, where we don't have power and we need regular irrigation because you're basically growing in the beach. It's 98% sand, so it has no water holding capacity. But this system at a little over $100, you can still water volumetrically. You just have to run a little bit of a test to figure that out. So you can still get a flow meter without a sensor, and you can still basically set up a dummy system outside of your high tunnel. I run the same amount of header pipe I'm going to run, the same amount of T-tape I'm going to run. I've got 5 rows that are 80 feet long. That's the same thing that I need to have outside when I'm running the test. And so if I come to the conclusion of what the total volume of water it is that I need on an individual irrigation event, then what I can do from there is I can run a timer, run a stopwatch in conjunction with the flow meter, and see how long it takes to put out that many gallons of water. And the other thing that I didn't mention is, in this situation, I would rather water in small amounts. And so I was watering 4 times a day instead of once every 2 to 3 days. And so you may think that's a lot. Well, you're not necessarily watering a large amount at each of those irrigation events. You're taking your total volume of water and breaking that up. And if I can give you an example, if you're stranded in the desert and somebody gives you a 5-gallon bucket of water, would you want them to throw that in your face first thing in the morning, or would you want them to give you a small cup so you can sip on that 5-gallon bucket of water throughout the course of the day? And so that's kind of the perspective of the tomato and the concept of blossom end rot, regular irrigation events, and certainly we can talk more about this. There's just not enough time to cover everything today. I won't spend a lot of time on this. Krista covered tensiometers very well. The only thing that I'll mention in my experience is there are 2 different types of tensiometers, and commonly what most people are familiar with and what most even suppliers have are the high tension tensiometers. Through the research that I've looked at and what I found even talking with the company, for sensitive crops like vegetables, you should really be it's in your best interest to use the low tension model. At first I had several leftover versions of the traditional model. I thought it would be simple enough just to change the gauge, and I was assured that it was not that simple. The workings of components of that are a little bit different, so you do have to buy a separate low tension tensiometer. There is at least one supplier in the state that I've actually talked to about this already, and he said that he would start actually getting the low tension tensiometers. The traditional tensiometers with a higher tension are generally meant for row crops like corn and soybeans. talk about some of the different application methods. You saw how I was broadcasting my pre-plant fertilizer application. There are some options in the lower middle picture you can see there for directed pre-plant application. Some of the plastic layers you can adapt or purchase a fertilizer hopper on, or you can do it by hand if your structure is small enough. I've done that as well. But then the other thing that you would think about in most of the systems I've worked in is fertigation. And so you have various fertigation systems, but one of the things that I often like to think about is, things can go wrong in farming, and quite often they do, and you have failures. So what I'm showing you here is, first of all, the necessary components you need. So we've got filters to the left of the blue injectors. We also have pressure gauges on either side of the injectors so we can check inlet pressure and outlet pressure, because our T-tape or emitters are going to be designed to work within a certain range. At this location, we were on well water, and our well pressure exceeded 140 psi. And in most situations that I would ever work in a T-tape or drip tape or even drip emitter, that's going to blow those right out. So you need to get that probably well below 20 psi to make most of those operate. But the other thing you may notice in there is we have union couplers in there, and so we can simply take out one of the injectors if we need to repair it, instead of hard threading it in or hard gluing it in to those injectors. And then the other thing you may see in the background is an additional set of injectors. So we created this manifold system where we can open and close a few ball valves. If we have a failure or a problem with one of the solenoids or one of the injectors, we can change those ball valves to the appropriate position, start running the injectors that are in the background, and then have additional time to work on the primary injectors. So looking at determining crop need and fertility, so one of the good starting places for Kentucky would be the ID36, or the Commercial Vegetable Production Guide. I believe Miranda's got that file for download available in the lower left of our screen. The other thing that we need to be critical of and think of, to me, it doesn't change whether you're in a high tunnel or open field. You really need to be taking soil tests and being conscious of what's in there. And in particular, if I'm going to try to help you, if I don't know what's already there, it's very hard to give you the best recommendation that's going to be economic and also the best in the environmental perspective as well. And then we can talk about some in-season monitoring, which Krista's already mentioned a little bit about nutrient or tissue testing rather. So at the top here, you see visual, the older method, and oftentimes people will still use that. But what I can tell you is, if you're using the visual method, frequently you're going to be behind, and then you're playing a game of catch-up. And it's very difficult to catch up working with tomatoes or certainly many other vegetable crops. The other thing that I've seen done in season is some sort of testing of the substrate. Whether in this case it would be traditional field soil, and so you might want to look at what's currently there, what's going on, or what might be changing in a given season. That's not something that I would recommend on a regular basis through the growing season, but maybe once or twice in a season that might be something to think about. You also want to be aware of the pH, and you have portable meters you can see there pictured below that are capable of testing your soil pH. You can also do the same thing with electrical conductivity with some of these meters as well. Now, for nutritional monitoring, the other thing you might consider is to see if your injector is working correctly, is you can test the irrigation solution or the fertigation solution that you're putting out using some of these cardiometers. These cardiometers can be a little bit expensive. For the both of them, you're probably looking at around $700 to $800 investment. The one that's long and narrow and green and white is the nitrate meter. The one I have pictured on the right is the potassium meter in blue, but the potassium meter is now, what I have pictured here is the old model. The new potassium meter looks just like the nitrate meter you see on the left. So you can't test all of the nutrients, but nitrate, nitrogen, and potassium are pretty critical for many crops, and certainly critical for tomato crops, as you'll see here in a moment. So these meters have dual purposes. So you can test the nutrient solution that you're putting on, but you can also do petiole sap testing. And with these, they generally come with the guidelines that were developed at University of Florida by George Hockley, or also at UC Davis out in California. And it will give you the guideline for the given crop stage of what the petiole nitrate, nitrogen concentration or potassium concentration should be. So for instance, whether it's in the early vegetative growth for tomatoes or whether it's in the fruiting stages, those tissue concentration levels will change. And then also, I would always recommend laboratory tissue analysis throughout the season at varying points, maybe every few weeks, to get an idea. And the laboratories can test for all the nutrients, not just nitrate and potassium, or nitrogen and potassium. And so it can give you a better picture of what's going on. And some of the labs that I've worked with in the state are very quick, usually can have those results turned around in 48 hours. That's something that's just good, because if you need to make changes, you need to make them now. So again, we'll use tomatoes for an example. For the ID36 recommendations for open field, the nitrogen recommendation rate is 125 to 150 pounds per acre. And depending on your soil test, your P2O5 or your phosphorus or your potassium additions are going to range from 0 to 240 or 0 to 250. So that's a pretty broad range, and to me that's another reason to show that why the soil test is important, because it's going to dictate how much potash or how much phosphorus we're going to apply. I'm usually looking at applying around 50 pounds of the nitrogen up front pre-plant in some sort of dry material form. Soil pH is really critical. I know people talk about it from a soils perspective, but it really is important. And some of the research that I've seen, it's at a pH of 7 in tomatoes, you can have potentially a 25% yield reduction. And I don't know any farmer, regardless of what crop they're growing, at least in horticultural crops, that can survive a 25% yield reduction and stay in business very long. If you remember, I mentioned potassium and nitrogen being really important a moment ago. Is really critical for tomatoes. For most crops, people always think nitrogen is king, or for many crops, we often think in agriculture nitrogen is king. And don't get me wrong, it is important. But potassium is equally important. And in tomatoes, it's more important, in my opinion. And you can look at some of the numbers that I have there. So in the vegetative state, it's about a 1-to-1 ratio, about 1.2 to 1 potassium to nitrogen ratio. But as you get into flowering, you're starting to fruit, you're looking at about 2.5 times the amount of potassium needed relative to the amount of nitrogen that you're putting on. Part of that is because 70% of the potassium is moving directly into those fruit. And if you ever cut the top off your tomato and you see white tissue around the top, that's generally going to be a potassium deficiency. And then some people maybe have the mindset that too much fertilizer can't be a problem, but I can assure you too much nitrogen in tomatoes can certainly be a problem. It can lead to bullish plants. Krista or John, one of the two, mentioned it earlier already. And again, like I tell many growers, I don't know many people that can sell tomato leaves. I know you can sell tomatoes, but if you're going to grow tomato leaves and you can find a market, let me know. This is just some images here I've got. This is vigorous crop growth on an indeterminate tomato crop, and I've grown both indeterminate and determinate tomatoes in high tunnels. Here you see pictured, we've got a determinate tomato crop growing in a modified trellis system. It's something that I learned about in Florida and worked with in Florida. We call it a Spanish trellis system. And it certainly, there's a lot of ins and outs in that. If you have questions about that, certainly feel free to get in touch with me at a later date. But from my opinion, comparing it to the Florida weave, it is superior because it opens up the canopy for air movement to reduce disease development. It also opens up the canopy so you can get pesticide penetration into that canopy. And that's going to be important whether you're organic or conventional. If you're not getting good penetration into the canopy, it does you no good. And then oftentimes in the Florida weave, I find that when you go to harvest the plants, you start tearing the plant apart in that system because it's just smashed together. And I would still use the Florida weave in the open field, but in a high tunnel, when you're trying to hit that high value market, you want the best product possible. And I believe the Spanish trellis system can help you with that. Just a different perspective here, a different side shot of the Spanish trellis system. We're basically creating a cage out of string. And again, there's some fine details that are important, but due to the time today, I won't cover those. But again, feel free to get in touch with me at a later point, and I'll be happy to talk about that. Won't spend a lot of time. I've pretty much touched on these, but blossom end rot is related to calcium and irrigation, and I think from my own experience, I feel like I'm firm on it that irrigation is just as important, if not more important, than the calcium. I see a lot of guys even trying to spray foliar calcium, and you're really not going to get enough into the plant to deal with the issue of blossom end rot. For as far as irregular ripening, you see in the lower middle picture and in the lower right picture internal white tissue. Those are both going to be tied to potassium management and also irrigation management. And so just keep in mind that nutrient may be present in the soil, but if you don't have it present in the soil solution, which is the water that is present, making it soluble, it's not going to get into the root system, and it's not going to get into the plant. So, we talk about tomatoes a lot just because that does predominate high tunnels throughout the Midwest and other parts of the country right now. But I would push you to think about other crops and think about other things. I would think possibly, and certainly Tim Woods would be more of an expert on this, but at some point the market may saturate with fresh tomatoes. You also may think about disease building up or other sorts of pest problems building up as you grow tomatoes year after year. And those might be some of the benefits like you saw with some of the movable stuff that Krista showed earlier. It can help you get out of that rut of growing the same crop on the same soil year after year. But the one thing, looking at alternatives, it's got to be market driven. And this is pictured here, a mentor of mine from my days at Florida. This is Eric Simone, and one of the things he told me a long time ago is there's no money in growing vegetables. There's only money in selling vegetables. And that's very important. It's something that I'll never forget. We can grow a crop very well, but can we be profitable from it? That's another question. It's something you need to consider and think about. So due to time today, I'm only going to touch on one other crop. I'm going to talk about specialty cucumbers because I've had some experience growing these in both soilless and in soil conditions in high tunnels. I'm going to talk about two main varieties. Both of them are going to be seedless varieties. The first is English cucumbers, which are around 12 to 18 inches in length, around 1.5 inches to 2 inches in diameter. You might have seen these already available in grocery stores. They're usually individually shrink wrapped. The price for those at the retail level is $1.50 to $2 a piece is usually what I've seen, sometimes higher. And then the other type of cucumber that I've looked at is a beta alpha cucumber, which you'll see here in a moment in a picture. To give you a better idea, this is a very small cucumber, 4 to 6 inches in length, very thin skin, so it's nice. You don't have to peel it for eating it. About 1 inch in diameter. Those are usually sold in a 4-pack, about $2 to $3. And then so, we talk about market, we talk about price. Well, if you compare those to traditional field slicing cucumbers, which sell for about 50 cents a piece, you can see there's a significant improvement on price or significant increase in value over a different type of cucumber you might grow. So we have pictured here on the left beta alpha cucumbers, and we've got a 12-inch ruler for just frame of reference. And you see on the right we have the English cucumber. Again, I mentioned these are both seedless. So you say, why is that nice? Well, from a consumer's perspective, sometimes they may not desire the seeds, but from the pollination perspective, you don't need pollination in this situation. So that may be something easier for you to manage and something we didn't touch on with tomatoes, but pollination is something you certainly need to be conscious of and be considering after you've invested all of that time and money as well. Briefly talk about the pruning system. Utilize an umbrella system, and essentially once this is trellised up a string, you start letting some of the lateral shoots growing down. In the English system, all the lateral shoots are removed as you would in an indeterminate tomato system. You're only setting fruit on the main stem. The beta alpha types, you're actually letting lateral shoots develop, but you're pruning them after the first node. So you're setting fruit on the main stem and fruit on the first node of the lateral. So you're getting multiple fruit per node as well, where you're generally only getting 1, maybe 2 fruit per node on the English types. So you see on the right English types, you can see some of the long fruit, and usually it's about 1 fruit per node. If you look at the prolific growth on the beta alphas, you see extremely large number of fruit, much more than what you see on the right with the English types. But the other thing that might be pretty critical that I want to point out to you if you're considering this is how often can you harvest? With the beta alpha types, if you're going to harvest them at the appropriate size, this is daily harvest. You go more than 1 day without harvesting, you're going to have oversized fruit. Now, maybe you can find an alternative for market for that, but that's not what this crop was initially intended for. The other thing is with the English types, you can go every other day. And it makes sense to me. It takes less time to grow a smaller cucumber, which is harvestable, versus a bigger cucumber. But if you need a little bit more time between harvests, then maybe the English type is something you might think about. Won't spend a lot of time on this. Basically summarizing this data, we've got cucumber harvest from the 2012 season. On the right, we have the varieties listed. The top 2 varieties, Manar and Sarig, are the beta alpha types. The bottom 4, Kalunga, Takaja, are the English types. If you look at the second column, marketable fruit number per plot, you can see that Manar and Sarig have a significantly greater number of fruit per plot as compared to the English types. But if you look at total fruit weight, which is the 4th column and highlighted in red, you can see that the marketable fruit weight is comparable or actually a little bit less in the beta alphas than it is in the English types. And so you have to consider how you're selling this. Are you selling it by piece or are you selling it by the pound? And due to the great diversity we have in our markets in Kentucky, you might be doing it one way or the other, and that may dictate your decision on which direction to go. But in summary of this data, the beta alphas produce more fruit compared to the English. Total fruit weight was greater in the English type. I will say the Sarig, which is one of the beta alpha types, they both seem to show signs of the powdery mildew and downy mildew problems that we encountered earlier than the English types. And so that's something else that you might want to think about. Beta alpha types were ready for harvest sooner. Again, that makes sense to me because you're harvesting a much smaller fruit. And this was, maybe I failed to mention, but this was a crop that was planted late July. So this was a crop we carried in the fall after a tomato crop. So this was a double crop. After our tomato crop, we ripped out and didn't reform the beds, didn't do any of that. We punched new holes, used the same T-take, and we were off and running. So with that, if we have time for questions, I think now we have our Q&A session. Certainly we have questions for John, Krista, and myself. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all. We really appreciate it. We do have a few questions here, so we'll get to those right away. So probably for Krista, on the green spacing slide, did you mean cooking greens?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, great. Thank you very much. Because we know you were talking about lettuce and greens.
Yeah, that's well. So we do 12-inch spacing on all of those. We always do 12-inch, both in row and between row on cooking greens. You could push lettuces a little bit closer if you're going to harvest them small and it's a smaller variety. A big romaine or something like that, that's going to be too tight. But you could go 8 to 12 on lettuces. But when I saw that question pop up, and yeah, it was cooking greens.
Okay, great. And I think another one probably for you, and maybe Shubin can address this too. How far apart would you recommend spacing tomatoes?
It does depend a little bit on on your overall square footage per plant. But for us in our setup, we put them on 18 inches between plants in the row. Shubin, how about you?
As far as in-row spacing, I mean, I've seen as tight as 12 inches. I wouldn't recommend doing that. I've seen a lot of disease problems develop from that. I've done it myself at 24 inches, and I was able to pull yields 25 to 27 pounds per plant over one harvest window from, say, the 1st of June to the end of July. But my colleague, my former colleague at Purdue, has carried on some of that work, and I think 18 inches, what Krista said, might be a good happy medium. But even when I've crunched numbers, when I've seen guys plant on tighter areas, I've still been able to pull out more ultimate weight using the production system that I did. As far as between row spacing, again, I've seen all types. I've seen as tight as 3 feet. Again, I wouldn't recommend 3 feet because of airflow and air movement. Again, kind of as a general rule of thumb, I feel like you ought to be able to walk through the row middle as you normally would walk, as opposed to turning to your side and sidestepping. If you're having to do that, your plants are probably planted at too high of a density, and you're likely going to see certainly some disease issues. But bottom line is, I would probably not recommend going tighter than 4, but I've seen it done on 5, and that's kind of where I'm recommending doing it and where I would like to see it done.
A rule of thumb that I've heard is 5 to 6 square feet per plant. So that would account for your between bed spacing and your within row spacing.
And I think there'll be some variance on that, whether you're doing an indeterminate or determinate system, because I've seen both of those, and you may end up packing your indeterminate tomatoes tighter because you are doing so much pruning and removing so much of the foliage, where the determinates are much more of a whole bush.
Okay, great. Thank you both. We did have just one more comment. Someone says they've got standing water in their high tunnels just from all the rain and snow. Do you guys have any ideas about how they can prevent that or help
raised
move
beds,
that
like she's been mentioned.
water out?
Well, I've got some firsthand experience in that as well. So the raised beds help, but we had more water than the raised beds could even handle, at least on the outer rows. It didn't get into the middle rows. And fortunately, because we had that ground cover, if you remember seeing the white ground cover, I actually bought a submersible pump, and I pumped it out. And so that's temporary, and so that will get it out, but it got it out much quicker than it would have if we naturally let it drain. Now the other thing is much more laborious, and much more time consuming, but really is something you might consider doing, and it's something that we're talking about in the way that we're building our current facility, or adding to the current facility at the Hort Research Farm. But using drain tile and actually digging trenches along the perimeters of your structure, burying drain tile and trying to channel that. Now, if you haven't built your structure yet, the sky's the limit, and you've got a lot more options to be proactive. And that's really what I recommend. But if you're in a position where you've already got it built and you've got a problem, you might consider, digging some ditches and burying some drain tile. You might even consider adding some gravel at the bottom of that trench before you even add the drain tile in. I've seen some discussion of people talking about gutters as well, something I haven't done yet, but I've utilized in greenhouse systems for a number of years. Certainly something that we could consider and look at. I just think there's been maybe some more engineering issues of how to get around the opening sidewall and things of that nature, but I don't think it's something that I would rule out entirely. And then if you add the gutters to that, maybe, I don't recall, maybe Krista, you talked about that earlier, but you talk about the rain catchment. Is that something that you can do to utilize irrigation water in some sort of other crop or even within the structure itself, assuming that it's soil applied?
Okay, well, thank you all. We have one more question so far, but before we get to that, I just want to remind everyone we have a follow-up survey. It would be really great if you could help us with some feedback about what you learned tonight. Again, we're sorry that we ran over a little bit, but I think we had some really great information and I didn't want to cut anybody off. So thank you for bearing with us and thank you for joining us. But I think our last question is, do you guys have recommended suppliers for the low tension tensiometer?
Edward Martin in Casey County is the one supplier I talked to about getting those in. Trying to think of it's a data logging spec meters or it's
Barometer?
well, Aerometer is the manufacturer and you can contact them directly, but it's a company based out of Illinois that sells data loggers that will also sell that type of equipment. Spectrum Technologies, that they sell data loggers, but they also sell different soil testing probes, and they sell some of those pH and EC meters that I showed you earlier. But I've also seen where they've had tensiometers as well in the past. That may be another source. And I know I don't have the web address now, but my email is available. If you email me, I can certainly give you that link at a later date.
Okay, thank you all. So I think that's all the questions we've got this evening. So thank you all for participating. Thank the three of you presenters for presenting. It was really a great presentation tonight. And like we said, contact us with any questions or any comments, and please fill out that survey for us. So thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.